Asks for death. He opened his eyes. The smell hit him first burnt spice, sharp in his sinuses, the chemical residue of a trance that had nearly dissolved his sense of self. Sand vibrated under his palms. Through the rock floor of the chamber he could feel the deep tremor of a worm passing somewhere miles below, and for a moment that vibration was indistinguishable from his own heartbeat. In his inner ear, a voice was still fading, his father's voice, repeating words Paul had spoken years ago. You are a child seeking to be a man. When you are a man, you will seek in vain for the child you were. The voice faded. Only his own breathing remained. He was lying on sand in the chamber beneath Jacurutu. The flare had died. Gurney was standing over him, and another man stood at his side, a Fremen with a scarred face and the tortoise ring of his tribe on his knife hand. Namri has back, Gurney said. He asked for death, Namri replied. That was the test. He had to ask for death before he could be spared. Aye, he asked. Leto sat up. The movement was slow, deliberate. He was still learning how his body responded now. It was his body. The other voices were still present, but they were background music, not competing commands. Namri studied him. What do you see, Atreides? You came out of the trance muttering about armor. A terrible glove. What does that mean? Leto met the Freeman's stare. It means the test is bigger than my grandmother intended. She wanted to know whether I was abomination. She got her answer, am not. But the trance showed me something she didn't plan for. He paused. The words were still forming, settling into the calm architecture his inner integration had built. The golden path. Namr's hand moved toward his Christ knife. The golden path? My father's vision. The path he refused. The path that no one else could walk because no one else could see its full length. Leto felt the shape of the revelation still settling, like sand after a storm. I can see it now. I couldn't before, not clearly, but the trance unlocked the full pattern. And I know what the armor is for. What armor? Gurney's voice was rough with something that might have been relief or dread. The armor I have to build. The transformation. There are Sandtrout in the Quanats across this desert, and I can feel a migration coming, a movement toward open water near a place called Shulak. That's where I'm going next. Namor's face hardened. The boy's possessed after all. Nobody touches the Sandtrout. They are Shai Hulud's children. Not possessed, Leto said, integrated. He stood, finding his balance, feeling the observer still holding the inner lives in alignment. I have earned a provisional future here. You said so yourself. I know you sabotaged my still suit, Namri heel pumps cut with a needle knife, or I would know soon enough. You want to test whether I can survive the desert. I will. Namra's eyes flickered. He said nothing. Your niece Sabiha will be sent to watch me while I'm here, Leto continued. That's already in motion, isn't it? He was not reading Namra's thoughts. He was reading the pattern the vision had shown, the thread of a young woman with desert brown skin and a knife always at her belt. When she arrives, I will do what the vision requires. And then I will leave for Shulak, and you will not stop me. He moved toward the chamber's exit, a passage leading deeper into the sietch, where a small cell waited, with sand for a bed and a glow globe for light. Namri and Gurney watched him go, footsteps on basalt, a silhouette in the doorway blocking the glow globe's light, and then the scrape of a bowl being placed on sand. Leto opened his eyes. The young woman who had entered straightened and met his gaze. Her skin was desert brown, her eyes calculating odds in the space of a single breath. The Christ knife at her belt was not ceremonial. The grip showed wear from use. She was exactly as the vision had shown her. Sabiha, Leto said. She hesitated. You know my name. Your Namor's niece. He assigned you to watch me. He assigned me to bring you food. She gestured at the bowl. The gruel inside carried the faint blue shimmer of spice saturation. Eat. Leto sat up, cross-legged on the sand, and studied her. The vision had shown him threads connected to this woman, some sweet, some terrible. One thread in particular carried a warmth that was almost enough to pull him off the golden path entirely. He had followed that thread to its ending agonies, and then set it aside. Sabiha, he said, in 3 days I will leave this sietch. You have 2 choices. You can help me, or you can stand aside. But you cannot stop me. You can't leave. Namri would kill me. Namri will do what he does. But the vision shows 2 paths for you. On one, you bleed out on the sand because you tried to stop someone who cannot be stopped. Amri. On the other, you live. He held her eyes. The thread that leads to your death is very short. The thread that leads to your life is longer than you can imagine. Her hand had moved to the Kreis knife, but she did not draw it. You've seen this? In your visions? I've seen it, and I've seen that you will choose correctly. This was not quite true. Ends will always introduce fog into prescience. But Leto had learned from his father's mistakes. Stating a vision confidently could sometimes bring it into being, because people believed it had already been determined. Sabaya's hand dropped from the knife. What do you want me to do? Nothing. Stay in this cell until sunrise on the fourth day. He used voice, and this time she could not resist. Her body relaxed, her eyes glazed. She would remain here until dawn, and by then Leto would be long gone. He took nothing from the Siet except the stillsuit he was wearing. He moved through the corridors in the dark, using ancestral memory of Sietch architecture to avoid the patrols, and reached the outer fissure without encountering anyone. The night air hit him like a shock. He was free, he was alone, and 10 minutes later, checking his suit's pressure seals, he found the damage Namri had left for him. Heel pumps cut with a needle knife, precise and quiet. Half his body's water would be gone by dawn. In the deep desert, that was a death sentence. But Leto was not going to the deep desert, not yet. He was going to Shulok. He crossed nearly 200 kilometers on Wormback, repairing the stillsuit as he went, using sand snorkel tubing to bypass the damaged pumps. The spice gruel still sang in his blood, keeping his prescient awareness sharp. On the second day, he saw it, a distant glint on the southern horizon, sunlight reflecting off a thopter canopy. The glint held position for 10 heartbeats, then banked east and vanished. A scout. Someone was tracking his progress, watching his worm's heading. Leto did not change course. Fina livid. He let them watch. If the scouts belonged to Shulok, and the vision suggested they did, then arriving under observation would serve his purpose better than arriving in secret. A boy who found the hidden smuggler's stronghold on his own was a threat. A boy the smugglers had already chosen to follow was a curiosity, and curiosity opened doors. He let them find him. On the third day, when a light thopter banked down toward his position, he was sitting cross-legged on a dune with the patience of a stone. What traveler goes there? The smuggler demanded in the traditional phrase. Tanzer Batig, Leto replied. I travel south from Jacurutu. The man laughed a harsh, surprised sound. You are the strangest thing I've ever seen in the Tanzaruft. I need to speak with Maurice. The laughter died. How do you know that name? The same way I know that Shulok is not a myth, that Asan Tariq guides the preacher, and that your people have been tracking me since I left the Tabu Sietch. Leto met the smuggler's stare. I know many things. All of them will interest your leader. The flight to Shulok took an hour. The thopter descended through a narrow cut between two cliffs, then into a cavern mouth hidden by a holographic projection of rock. Inside, the cavern opened into a network of chambers carved from living stone, illuminated by glow globes at regular intervals. The air smelled of spice and stillsuit reclaimers, and a faint sharpness that Leto's Bene Gesserit ancestor identified as explosive residue. Marith met them in the largest chamber. He was a lean man with white-streaked hair and a face that had seen enough desert to make it unreadable. His son Asan stood at his shoulder, same lean build, same unreadable expression. You are Leto Atreides, Maurice said, the dead twin. Our scouts have been watching your progress from Jacurutu. You didn't try to evade them. No, I needed you to know I was coming. That's either very brave or very foolish. Or well-informed. Leto stepped forward. You know Namri sabotaged my stillsuit. You know the preacher, the blind man your son guides is my father. And you know the worms are dying. Maurice's expression did not change. If the preacher is your father, this planet has a great deal to answer for. It does, but the answers won't come from the priesthood or alias regency. Leto drew his Kreis knife. The movement was sudden, but Maurice did not flinch. Leto reversed the knife and offered it hilt first. I need allies. You need to know what's happening to the worms. The ecological transformation is killing them. If no one stops it, there will be no spice within 3 generations. No worms, no Fremen, nothing but water-fat foreigners building cities on the sand. Maurice glanced at the offered knife. You'd give me your weapon? It'd give you my blood. Leto used the knife point to open a small cut on his palm. Blood welled up, dark against the desert pallor of his skin. He extended the hand toward Maurice. Drink, become my water brother. You are the Wadkias, the spirit river. Let me be part of your river. The silence stretched. Asan shifted. Muriz put a hand on his son's arm. You're 9 years old, Muriz said. In this body, yes, in my memories, I am millions of years old. I carry the Atreides line and the Harkonnen and every human life that fed into them. I have seen the golden path. The trance at Jacurutu forced it open my grandmother's test. Namris needle, Gurney's injector. They wanted to know if I was abomination. What they got instead was a vision that none of them can walk. I can. Maurice looked at the blood welling in Leto's palm. Then, deliberately, he took the boy's hand and drank. Wadkias, he said when he raised his head. You are bound to us. We cannot harm you without harming ourselves. And I cannot harm you. Leto wiped the blood on his stillsuit. Now, take me to the Kanat. There's something I need to show you and something I need you to understand. The golden path is not a choice I made. It's the only thread that doesn't end in extinction. My father saw that thread and turned away. Aaliyah never saw it at all. The burden passed to me, and I'm going to carry it. The transformation that starts tonight will take 4,000 years to finish. At the end of it, I will go into the sand and the worms will return, and humanity will have learned through pressure, through oppression, through a peace so long that no one alive remembers war, the one lesson that prevents extinction. That is the golden path. Muriz listened without speaking. Then he turned and led Leto to the Khanat. The Sandtrout become his skin. The Khanat ran along the western face of the canyon, a narrow channel of open water fed by wind traps and protected by predator fish. Leto knelt beside the water and listened. Soft splashes as Sandtrout dropped into the stream, the swirl of fish chasing them, the constant rhythm of life trying to contain life. I need to borrow your stillsuit, Leto said. In returning it, Maurice, standing behind him with Asan and several of the cast-out, stared. You want my stillsuit? I want to show you what I must become. Maurice hesitated, then began removing the suit. When he was down to his desert undergarments, Leto took it and laid the suit aside. Sabiha had arrived from Jacurutu an hour earlier, her face still dazed from the voice command she had finally shaken off. She stood at the edge of the gathering, watching. Leto plunged his right hand into the cool water. Something leathery and supple drifted against his fingers almost immediately. A sand trout, diamond-shaped, nearly as long as his forearm. Its cilia extended, tasting the moisture gradient. He did not resist. He let the cilia probe, let the creature assess. Then he used the enzyme control Alia had discovered. His flesh adjusted. The sand trout hesitated, then relaxed. Its cilia locked into his skin, not draining him, but sealing themselves to him, forming a living membrane that would become part of his own body. It's not attacking, Asan whispered. It doesn't recognize me as prey. Leto lifted his hand from the water, the sand trout still attached. Its body was already beginning to flatten, spreading across his palm. He reached into the Kanat again and found another sand trout, then another. Within an hour, he had covered himself completely from neck to feet. The sand trout overlapped like scales, their cilia interlocking into a continuous membrane that absorbed his perspiration and returned it in a form the creatures could tolerate. When he bit into one of the cuffs, a sweet syrup filled his mouth, the sand trout's internal moisture, purified by its own biological processes. The membrane made him faster than human. His first steps launched him across the chamber, crashing into a wall before he could adjust. The sand trout amplified muscle movement, turning ordinary effort into superhuman force. He could leap from dune crest to dune crest. He could run faster than any Fremen had ever run. He could climb vertical rock with the ease of a lizard, and Shai-Hulud would not attack him. To a worm, he would appear only as a mass of sand trout, something to be ignored, not devoured. This is the armor I saw in my visions, Leto said. His voice sounded thicker. The membrane was already changing his vocal cords. This is the terrible glove. It will grow stronger. It will become inseparable from my flesh. I will never be fully human again. From the edge of the gathering, Sabiha made a sound sharp, wordless. Leto turned toward Muriz. I'm leaving Shulak tonight. I need to intercept the preacher in the inner desert. After that, I go to Arakin to confront my aunt. You'll keep the cast out neutral until I call for you. And if you don't call, then the Golden Path will find another vessel. But it won't. I've seen the thread. It holds. He faces the preacher. The desert south of Shulak was the kind of place that had never been mapped. The Fremen called it the Tanzaruft, the land of terror, and avoided it unless necessity drove them there. Even the worms were larger here, older, more deliberate in their movements. The sand had a different color, black flecked with red, as though it had absorbed the blood of everything that had ever died in it. Leto moved through this landscape with the certainty of someone who no longer depended on maps. His prescient awareness, sharpened by the trance and the membrane's constant spice feed, showed him the shape of what was coming. At the center of that shape was a figure in a robe, blind, step-sure in the sand, with a young guide walking ahead of him. Puh! Leto waited on a dune crest until he saw the worm. It was a big one, nearly 20 meters in diameter, its passage sending tremors through the sand that preceded it by minutes. Paul and his guide had already dismounted from an earlier worm. The new worm was drawn by their vibrations, the rhythmic thump of footsteps that promised moisture. When the worm was 200 meters away, Leto stepped into its path. The guide saw him and froze. Paul kept walking for 3 more steps, then stopped. The blind man's head turned, the eyeless sockets searching for a shape they could not perceive. Tariq, Leto said. His voice, filtered through the Sandtrout membrane, had a resonance no human throat could produce. Tell the man you serve that his son is here. Asen began the ritual that would summon safety from the approaching worm, but Leto raised a hand. No, let it come. The worm crested the nearest dune and plunged toward them. The guide scrambled back. Paul stood his ground, his blind face turned toward the sound of the approaching behemoth. The furnace heat washed over them, the oven breath of Shai-Hulud, hot enough to boil water at 3 meters. Leto raised his right hand. The worm stopped. It did not stop gradually. It stopped, as though a wall had materialized in its path, its ringed body arching upward, sand cascading from its sides. The great mouth opened, revealing 1,000 crystalline teeth. Then the mouth closed. The worm settled. It recognized the sandtrout's scent engulfing Leto's body and found no moisture to draw it forward. "Remove your suit mask," Leto said. "You've been called the preacher long enough." Paul obeyed. The fold of his hood dropped. The mouth cover withdrew. Leto looked into his father's face for the first time in his conscious memory and saw the lines of his own future written there, the Atreides hawk profile, the high cheekbones of the Harkonnens, the desert-carved lines around a mouth that had once commanded an empire. "So Paul said." His voice was hoarse but steady. "You're not dead. The tiger attack was a ruse. Ghanima conditioned herself to believe I died. It was necessary. She would not have been convincing otherwise. And you came to the desert. You found Jacurutu. I found more than Jacurutu. I found the golden path." The name landed like a blow. Paul's jaw tightened, his shoulders pulled back a fraction of a degree. "You don't understand what you're saying," Paul said. "The golden path is not a choice, it's a sentence. It damns whoever walks it to an existence that is not human, not in any way that matters. I saw it 20 years ago, in the spice trance that made me Kwisatz Haderach. I could not do it. You walked into the desert instead, and the burden passed to Aliyah. You see what happened to her." Then it passed to me. "Alia." Paul's voice broke on the name. "Where is she now? What has become of my sister? She is possessed. The Baron Harkonnen lives in her consciousness. She speaks with his voice, moves with his memories. She has already tried to kill our grandmother. She controls the priesthood. When you walked into the desert, you left an opening, and the Baron found it." Paul made a sound that was not quite a word. The blind sockets of his eyes turned upward toward the sky. "You think you can walk the path I refused? I already have. Feel what I am." Paul reached out and touched Leto's arm. His fingers encountered the sandtrout membrane, the hard, overlapping scales, the slight give of living tissue. He drew a sharp breath. "Sandtrout. You've covered yourself with sandtrout. The membrane absorbs my perspiration, returns moisture to me in a form I can drink, amplifies my movement, protects me from Shai-Hulud, as you just saw. This is the armor the vision showed me. This is the transformation the golden path requires. Then you really are going to do it. I have no choice. Neither did you, once. You refused. Accepting." The guide, Asan, had been watching with the frozen stillness of a small animal facing a predator. Now he moved a quick, furtive gesture toward his belt, toward an inner pocket. Leto felt it before he saw it. The membrane against his skin picked up a subsonic hum, a field pulse-building charge. Something in Asan's hand was activating, drawing power from a microcapacitor, preparing to emit a vibration pattern designed to summon a worm to the nearest moisture source. Leto crossed the few meters between them faster than human eyes could track. His hand closed on Asan's wrist. The metallic object, a small disc, already warm and humming, clattered to the sand. A worm collar, Leto said. You were going to bring Shai-Hulud down on us. He crushed the disc under his heel. The humming stopped. I was protecting the preacher. Asan's face had gone pale. The preacher died on this dune. Whatever walks away from here is something else. Leto released the guide's wrist. You will guide us both to Gurney. He's waiting 2 kilometers northeast. After that, return to Shulok and tell Maurice what you saw. Leto turned back to his father. I'm going to Arakin to confront Alia. You're coming with me. The order was absolute. Paul felt the weight of it. If I refuse, you won't. Paul bowed his head, and the movement contained a grief so deep that Leto felt it as pressure in his own chest. The blind man, the failed god, the father who had never been present for the children who needed him most, stood motionless in the sand. And when he spoke again, his voice was the voice of someone who had finally stopped running. There is a curse upon our house. I know about the curse, Leto replied. Some curses are simply choices no one else was willing to make. You made yours. Now I'm making mine. Beneath them, the worm shifted. Its great body rumbled in the sand. Leto placed his hand on its flank and felt the furnace heat beneath the membrane, the slow pulse of Shai-Hulud's internal fires. They mounted the worm together. The desert stretched before them, and behind them the wind was already erasing the tracks they had made. On a worm moving through the deep desert, the transformation that no Atreides had been willing to accept was finally complete. Leto rode near the head, his Sandtrout membrane catching the furnace heat and converting it, his prescient awareness showing him the shape of Arakin waiting in the north, Alia's strong room, the window she would fall from, the door he would throw open with a strength no human arm could match. Paul rode behind him, blind and silent and done with prophecy. Somewhere in the northern desert, Ghanima was living with grief she had chosen to believe. Somewhere on Salusa Secundus, Jessica was training the Corino prince in the discipline that would one day make him a witness to the end of the old universe and the birth of the new. And somewhere in the keep at Arakin, Alia was giving orders she could not take back, while the Baron's voice laughed inside her skull. Paul Muad'Dib knew what lay ahead. He had seen it in the moment of his own prescience, the moment he had turned away from out of fear. Now he could say nothing, because the son he had never really known was walking the path that he had been too human to accept. The worm carried them northward. The desert swallowed their silence. Episode 3, The Breaking of Habits. Idaho sat across from Stilgar in the Naib's private chamber in Sietch Tabra, and his mentat mind was running a calculation that had only one possible outcome. The room was small, cut from the living rock generations ago, its walls stained by the smoke of countless spiced coffee sessions. Stilgar poured another cup, the ritual movements of Freeman hospitality covering the tension that had been growing between them for weeks. Idaho had come to Tabor as a fugitive from Alias' death warrant, and Stilgar had taken him in under the ancient laws of sanctuary, but sanctuary came with a price. Stilgar's neutrality, his refusal to choose between Alias priesthood and the scattered rebels who opposed her, had become a cage. Idaho could not send word to Jessica on Salusa Secundus. He could not contact the preacher. He could not act to protect Ghanima, who had become Stilgar's ward after Leto's supposed death. Every day that passed, Alia's grip tightened and the Baron's voice in her skull grew louder. Idaho knew the Baron was there. He had deduced it weeks ago, watching Alia's face shift when she thought no one was looking, the flicker of someone else's anger, someone else's cruelty, surfacing behind her eyes. Alia is possessed, he had told Stilgar the night he arrived. The Baron Harkonnen lives inside her. She knew about the tiger plot. She knew Leto was in danger before he left for the desert. Stilgar had listened and said nothing. He had listened every time Idaho raised the subject, and every time he had reached the same conclusion. Neutrality was safer. The Fremen had a saying, often there's no need to tear off an arm to remove a splinter. Stilgar believed in waiting, in letting the desert teach its own lessons, in preserving the tribe above all else. Idaho believed that time had run out. What happened next happened because Idaho was a mentat, and a mentat who accepted his own death as a variable could design equations that no living opponent could solve. The knife and the insults. Javid entered the chamber unannounced, as he always did. Javid was one of Alias' creatures, a handsome young man with quick eyes and the hushed, knowing manner of someone who gathered secrets the way Fremen gathered water. He was also Alias' lover, a fact that curled Idaho's stomach every time he saw him. Idaho had killed Harkonnens before. He had killed Sardaukar and smugglers and men who thought they were faster than a Janaz swordmaster. But Javid was a different kind of enemy, the kind who smiled while slipping poison into your coffee. Idaho drew his Kreis knife in one motion. Before Stilgar could speak, before Javid could react, the blade punched through Javid's chest. Javid staggered backward, pulling himself off the knife, a surprised sound escaping his lips. He turned, fell onto his face, and his legs kicked twice. Then he was still. The room went silent. The aide who had accompanied Javid stood frozen. Stilgar stared at the body. That was unnecessary, Stilgar said. His voice was quiet, dangerous. There is no more Alia, Idaho said. So you say. Idaho knew what he had to do now. Javid's death would silence the most obvious source of gossip between Tabr and the Regent's palace, but it was not enough. Stilgar would still wait. Stilgar would still cling to neutrality. Idaho had to force Stilgar's hand, and there was only one way to do it with a man like Stilgar. You had to make him angry enough to forget the consequences. You wear a collar, Idaho said. Stilgar's face went rigid. In Fremen culture, calling a man a slave was an insult that could only be answered with blood. But Idaho was not finished. You sold Fremen for their water. A second insult worse than the first. The Fremen survived on water. It was their currency, their sacrament, their bond with the tribe. To accuse a Naib of selling his people's water was to accuse him of betraying everything that made him Fremen. Stilgar's hand moved toward his knife, but Idaho held up 3 fingers. You will have no immortality, Idaho said. None of you. The name Stilgar will vanish from the memory of the tribes. You will die and be forgotten. The third insult was the one that broke the knob. Time was sacred to the Fremen. Time that stretched backward into ancestral memory. Time that could trap a man in prescient vision. To deny a man his place in the tribe's memory was to deny him his soul. Stilgar's knife came out. Idaho made no move to defend himself. The Naib drove the blade upward, through the diaphragm, into the heart. It was the stroke of a man who had killed more times than he could count. Precise and fatal. Idaho felt the shock, the spreading cold, the sudden absence of sensation in his extremities. His mentat mind, still operating in the final seconds before synaptic collapse, noted the completion of the equation. Stilgar had killed him. Stilgar would now have to flee or be executed by alias justice. Stilgar would take Ghanima with him. Ghanima would survive. Idaho's body hit the stone floor, and Duncan Idaho, the original, the Gola, the swordmaster of House Atreides, died for the second time. Stilgar stood over the body, breathing hard, the bloody knife still in his hand. He looked at Javid's corpse, then at Idaho's, and the realization hit him like a worm striking a thumper. Idaho had not been trying to kill him. Idaho had been trying to give him a reason to leave. That fool, Stilgar whispered, that cursed brave fool. He knelt beside Idaho's body and closed the eyes, the Talilaxu metal eyes that had seen too much, that had wept when alias possession became undeniable. Then he stood and began giving orders. His wives, his household, Ghanima, they would leave Tabr within the hour. Every person in his band would be offered a choice: stay and face alias judgment, or flee into the desert with a Naib who was now an outlaw. 60 people chose to follow him. Ghanima was among them. The desert band? For the next several weeks, Stilgar's band moved through the deep desert, staying clear of the major sieges and the patrols that alias priesthood had begun running. They camped in abandoned jadidas, the new towns that had been built during the greening, now cracking and crumbling as the desert reclaimed them. Ghanima walked among the ruins and read the story of her planet's retreat. The Qanat at this particular Didida had been shattered 5 times in 11 months, each time by the mysterious force the Fremen were calling the Desert Demon. No one had seen the demon clearly. Some said it was a rogue worm. Others said it was a band of revolutionaries from the Deep South, organized by smugglers who had turned against the priesthood. A few, the most superstitious, whispered that it was Shai Hulud himself risen in judgment against the transgressions of the Green. Ghanima knew better. She did not know how she knew because her conditioning prevented her from accessing the truth about Leto's survival, but the pattern of the attacks, kanats, wind traps, reseeding stations, anything that supported the terraforming project told her that someone was deliberately trying to restore the desert. She stood at the edge of the broken kanat and watched the birds feed on insects in the damp sand. Parrots, magpies, jays, creatures that had no business on Arrakis, brought here by the ecological transformation and now thriving in the wreckage. The irony was bitter. The Fremen had dreamed of a green Arrakis for generations, and now that the green was failing, they were terrified. I don't like this, Ghanima told Hara, who had become her closest companion in the band. Stilgar is meeting with Agarves tonight. He's a Naib's son, Hara said. Stilgar knows him. He's alias Messenger. He brought a pardon, and Stilgar listened. Stilgar will not accept the pardon. That's not what worries me. Stilgar is hearing him. He's let Nagarvi speak into his ear. And I remember Agarves from the old days in Tabr. He was always ambitious. Hada said nothing. She had learned to trust Ganima's instincts even when the girl could not fully explain them. The parley was set for dusk, after the moisture prayers and the evening meal. The meeting hall of the abandoned Jadida was low-ceilinged, built for function rather than ceremony, and the spice oil lamps threw wavering shadows across the faces of the 60 Fremen who crowded one end of the room. Agarves and his 9 companions sat opposite them, and the air was thick with smoke and mistrust. Ghanima positioned herself at the back of the council circle and watched. Agarv spoke smoothly, offering Stilgar a full pardon from the regent, restoration of his position as Naib, guarantees of safety for everyone in his band. His words were correct, his tone respectful. But his eyes moved too much. His hands touched his sash, his knife, his nose a constant, restless choreography of anxiety. He's not here to parley, Ghanima thought. He's here to do something else. Stilgar seemed to be wavering. Agarves's offer was generous, and the desert life was hard. The Naib leaned forward, asking a question about the terms. Agarves answered. The negotiation continued. Then something changed. Agarves's voice cracked just for a moment, but Ghanima heard it. The smooth mask slipped, and underneath it was raw disgust. She dirties everything she touches, Agarves said. Galia, everything. Stilgar let out a surprised laugh. It was the first honest thing Agarves had said all evening, and in that moment, Ghanima knew the parley was a trap. She turned to warn Hara, but a hand closed over her mouth from behind. The rag pressed against her face reeked of sleep drugs, the same compound that Fremen healers used for battlefield surgery, potent enough to drop a grown man in 3 breaths. Ghanima fought, but her body was already going slack. The last thing she saw was the ceiling beams, the dancing shadows, then cold air on her face and stars above her. She heard a voice, a man's voice, close above her say the words "not injured," and then something else she could not catch before the drug pulled her under. Grief in the council chamber. The report reached Aliyah in her private council chamber in Arakin's Keep, delivered by a breathless messenger who had run all the way from the landing pad. Idaho was dead. Stilgar had killed him and fled into the desert with half his sietch and the girl Ghanima. Aliyah received the news in silence. The messenger expected rage, perhaps an order for immediate pursuit, but the regent simply dismissed him with a wave of her hand. She stood alone in the chamber, staring at the wall hangings, the Atreides hawk, the Fremen water rings, the imperial lion that Paul had added after his victory over Shaddama I. Then she went to her private quarters and found the old silver and platinum buckle that Idaho had worn during their years together on Caladan. She held it in her hands for a long time. And Alia Atreides, the possessed regent of the known universe, wept. She wept for the Ghola who had been her husband and her only true ally in a court full of schemers. She wept for the man who had looked at her with trust when everyone else looked at her with calculation. She wept because some part of her, the part that was still Aliyah, the part that the Baron had not yet consumed, had genuinely loved him. The Baron's voice spoke inside her skull. Sentiment, a weakness. Be quiet, Aliyah said aloud. He would have betrayed you eventually. They all do. I said, be quiet. He stopped trusting you the night he saw your face change at dinner. You know this. You saw him see it. Aliyah closed her eyes. The Baron was right, and she had no answer. She called for Agarves, who had returned with the kidnapping party and was now waiting in the anteroom. The man entered warily, his earlier smoothness completely gone. He had seen Stilgar's face when they took Ghanima. He knew what he had done. Stilgar killed my husband, Aliyah said. Her voice was calm, measured. You will find Stilgar and kill him. Bring me his head. My lady, Stilgar has gone deep into the I did not ask for an assessment of the difficulty, Buer Agarve. I gave you an order. Agarves bowed and left. Aliyah sat down in her chair and placed the buckle on the table in front of her. The old Caladan silver glinted in the light. She remembered the day Idaho had first worn it, the way he had laughed when she teased him about the ancient fashion. She remembered his warmth beside her in the night, the rare moments when he let his mentat guard down and was simply a man who loved a woman. All of that was gone now. All of it was eaten by the thing that lived inside her. You did well, the Baron purred. The girl is ours. The Naib is disgraced, and the Gola is no longer a threat. The priesthood will now close ranks. The rebels will lose heart. This is victory, granddaughter. I am still Aliyah, she whispered. You are what you need to be, the Baron replied. That has always been the Atreides way, has it not? Whatever they need to be. The preacher's return. In the deep desert south of Shulok, Leto Atreides, I sat cross-legged on a dune and watched the sunrise over the Tanzaruft. The Sandtrout membrane had continued its integration. He could feel the cilia working their way into his organs, threading through his muscles, wrapping around his bones. The transformation was not done. It would continue for years, decades, slowly replacing his human tissues with a living armor that could not be pierced or poisoned or burned. He was no longer human. He was something that had never existed before in the history of the species, and the knowledge of what he had become was both terrible and liberating. Wast. End quote. Beside him, the preacher was preparing for the journey north. The preacher had accepted his role, guide, witness, bearer of truths that only a failed Messiah could speak. The father would accompany the son to Arrakeen, and together they would confront the sister who had been consumed by the grandfather. I want Gurney to survive, Leto said. Gurney has survived worse than what waits for him in the city, the preacher replied. You know what I mean. When we reach Arrakeen, things will move quickly. Aliyah will not surrender. The priesthood will not surrender. There will be killing, and you want to make sure that Gurney Halleck is not among the killed. He served our house faithfully for more years than most men live. He deserves to see the shape of what comes after, even if he cannot be part of it. The preacher nodded. His eye sockets had long ago healed over, the scar tissue smooth and pale. He no longer needed eyes to see. His prescient awareness, dormant for so many years, had begun to stir again in Leto's presence. You are coldly measured, the preacher said. When I was your age, I was still trying to avoid the deaths I saw in my visions. You calculate them as tactical variables. That is the golden path. Your way, the way of the human emperor, tried to preserve everyone. My way preserves only what must be preserved. It is a terrible burden. It is a necessary one. You taught me that, Father, not by your words, but by your failure. The preacher made a sound that was almost a laugh. You are not kind. Kindness is not part of the equation. They rose and began the trek toward the waiting worm. The preacher would ride as he always rode, guided by his young companion, Asan-Tariq, who had been sworn to secrecy about what he had witnessed. Leto would ride separately, ahead of them, scouting the route and smashing one more Qanat before they reached the city's outskirts. The desert demon needed to maintain his reputation. One more thing, Leto said. When you preach your final sermon in Arrakeen, do not hold back. I never have. You have always held back one thing. You have never named yourself. The preacher was silent for a long moment. The wind moved sand around their feet. Far to the north, a worm rumbled, feeling their vibrations. No, the preacher said at last. I have not named myself, but the time for hiding is over. If I am to be what you need me to be, the sacrifice that breaks the priesthood's grip, then they must know who they are killing. You have accepted that they will kill you? I accepted it 12 years ago, when I walked into the desert. I have been dead since then, Leto. This is merely the final ceremony. Leto looked at his father, the blind prophet, the failed god, the man who had loved too deeply and ruled too gently and left a wound in the universe that only his children could heal. In the place where Leto's heart had once been, something stirred, but the observer self noted it and filed it away. There was no room for grief in the golden path. "Then let us go," Leto said. "The city waits." The plaza of the temple. News of the preacher's approach spread through Arakeen faster than the official communications channels. Someone had seen him on the outskirts, led by his young Fremen guide. Someone else had recognized the blind man's gait, the distinctive robe, the harsh voice that could cut through a crowd's noise like a Kreis knife through silk. By the time the preacher reached the temple plaza, a mob had already gathered. Aaliyah watched from her eyrie, the high spy window that overlooked the plaza, the same window from which she had watched the preacher's first sermon months earlier. Below her, the crowd was a churning mass of robes and stillsuits, their faces upturned, their voices a low rumble of speculation. She had planned this differently. She had intended to bring Ghanima dressed as a Fremen bride, complete with knife and the preacher together, into her presence simultaneously. It would have been a coup de grace, a demonstration of total control. The heir presumptive and the rebel prophet, both reduced to props in her pageant of power, while Faradin and Jessica watched from the audience chamber. But the preacher had not waited for an invitation. He had come to the plaza on his own, and the crowd had swallowed him, and now she could not retrieve him without sending troops into the mob. The optics of that would be disastrous. She would look afraid. "Are you afraid, granddaughter?" the Baron asked inside her mind. "I am not afraid of a blind man. You should be. He has what you do not have, legitimacy. The people believe in him because he asks for nothing and promises nothing. He is the mirror in which they see their own suffering. He is a fanatic. He is your brother." The word hit Aaliyah like a physical blow. In the private spaces of her mind, she could still deny it. But the Baron knew, and now the Baron was forcing her to look at the truth. The preacher was Paul. Paul was the preacher. The brother she had worshipped and resented and finally hated was standing in her plaza, about to preach a sermon that she could not stop. "He will denounce you," the Baron said. "He will call you blasphemy. He will tell the crowd that you are possessed, and some of them will believe him. Then I will have him killed." "How? In front of the crowd? That would make him a martyr." "He will be dead. Dead men cannot be martyrs." The Baron laughed, a rich, rolling sound that echoed through the chambers of her skull. "Oh, granddaughter, dead men are the most dangerous martyrs of all." The final sermon. The preacher stood on the temple steps, one hand resting on his guide's shoulder, and let the crowd's noise wash over him. He could feel them, their heat, their breath, the scent of spice on their clothing, the electric charge of their expectation. He had preached in this plaza before, many times, but never with this sense of finality. Leto had been right. The time for sermons was over. What remained was a verdict. "People of Arrakis," the preacher began, and his voice carried through the plaza with a resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves. "You have gathered to hear the words of a blind man. Why? Because you suspect what you do not wish to admit. Because you know in the depths of your souls that I was not always blind." The crowd fell silent, the kind of silence that preceded violence. "You have built a religion upon the myth of Muad'Dib. You have raised temples and ordained priests and burned heretics. You have done all this in the name of a man who specifically commanded you not to do it. And now you come to me, hoping I will tell you that your temples are sacred and your priests are holy. I will tell you nothing of the kind." A ripple moved through the crowd, unease, anger, the first stirrings of rejection. "Your priests are merchants. They sell salvation the way the guild sells passage. They have taken the desert and turned it into a commodity. They have taken the Fremen and turned them into a commodity. They have taken Muad'Dib himself and turned him into a commodity, to be bought and sold and worshipped and forgotten, and at the head of this marketplace sits one figure, one who should have been the guardian of the faith, but who has become its betrayer." The preacher raised his arm and pointed, not vaguely, but with absolute precision, directly at the spy window where Aaliyah stood watching. In all the thousands of windows that ring the plaza, he pointed at hers without hesitation. "Blasphemy," the preacher shouted, "and the name of that blasphemy is Aaliyah." The crowd erupted, not in anger, in confusion. Some shouted for him to continue, others shouted that he should be taken down. The temple guards who had been stationed near the steps began to push toward him, but the press of bodies was too thick. The preacher lowered his arm. His voice, when he spoke again, was soft, so soft that only those nearest him could hear. "You can kill me now," he said. "It does not matter. I have been dead for 12 years. I died in the desert, in the place where I should have stayed. Everything since has been borrowed time, and borrowed time always comes due." A temple priest, a young man whose face was twisted with rage and fear, broke through the line of guards and lunged up the steps. The knife was in his hand before anyone could react. It sank into the preacher's chest, just below the sternum, the upward angle reaching the heart with the efficiency of someone who had been trained to kill quickly. The preacher fell. His body crumpled on the steps, the robes spreading around him like a dark stain. For a long, terrible moment, the plaza was silent. Then a white-haired man near the front of the crowd, a veteran whose stillsuit bore the faded marks of the old Fedaykin, raised both arms and screamed a name that had not been spoken in Arakin for 12 years. Muad'Dib! That was Muad'Dib! The crowd surged forward. Guards fought to contain them. The priest who had done the stabbing stood frozen, staring at the blood on his hands, as if he had only now understood what he had done. And high above, in the spy window, Aliyah watched the body of her brother being jostled by the crowd's movement. The preacher, Paul Muad'Dib, the man who had conquered the universe and then walked away from it, dead on the steps of his own temple, killed by one of his own priests, in front of a crowd that had come to hear the truth and received more of it than they could bear.